Hello and welcome to the pointZero sessions, where we meet the people and explore the ideas shaping the future of manufacturing supply chain. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Scott Paul, who is president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. Scott, welcome.
It's great to be with you today.
Great. And I'm Tim Coulthard. I'm editor of pointZero by Manucore, and this is
Maria Villablanca. I'm the group CEO and one of the co-founders of Manucore.
So Scott, thanks for joining us. And I know a lot of our friends and colleagues over in the US will know a lot about your organization, but for those elsewhere in the world, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what the organization does and what its key aims are.
Thanks, I'd be happy to. So the Alliance for American Manufacturing is a labor business partnership. It was established nearly 12 years ago by some leading domestic American manufacturers. Mostly in the metals sector, but in other sectors as well, along with a union partner, the United Steelworkers Union, which is North America's largest industrial union.
How would you assess the current state of U.S. manufacturing in 2018?
So U.S. manufacturing in 2018 is showing some surprising strength, I think. We've seen from an employment perspective very steady job growth, particularly over the last year and a half. We're also in the United States, where we've been able to add manufacturing jobs pretty continuously for about the last 8 years running. And I mention that because the last time we saw that in this nation was back in the 1960s. So this is certainly a trend that has passed a generation by. And I do not doubt the notion that we have some challenges ahead. But we're seeing good growth. We're seeing good forward indicating data. We're seeing some optimism among business leaders. The tax cuts that were passed by the Congress appear to have provided an investment stimulus. And while there's always uncertainty and things to work out, I think that we're on pretty steady footing now.
And are there any particular challenges that you're hearing from your members and the wider community around what gives them some cause for fear for the future?
Yes, and I think it depends on who you ask. But you could get a number of different responses. Certainly, the trade conversation in the United States has deep divisions. And if you're a metals producer, you probably think that the trade policy is going down an excellent path. If you're a metals consumer, you are facing some uncertainty because the policy still hasn't completely unfolded, and the alignment of the supply chains will probably that are happening. The renegotiated North American Free Trade Agreement is something that we still haven't had much clarity on. On the other hand, you're seeing some encouraging trends. The energy boom in the United States is continuing. That's obviously helpful for manufacturing. And then there's a couple of troubling signs when I talk to folks in the industry that they continue to worry about. We're in an era of low unemployment. It isn't the easiest thing in the world to find highly skilled workers in the right places. That's not to say that these workers aren't out there. There seems to be a geographical mismatch or a gap between the expectations for employers and what the market is bearing. And we're also seeing a little bit of plateauing in the auto sector, which has an enormous footprint in American manufacturing. And it's not a downward trend, but it is a plateauing. And that's been a source of steady growth for a number of years, again, for about the last 8 years. And so folks are keeping their eyes, I think, on that development as well.
Okay, and you mentioned automotive and also skills gaps, which I guess leads to discussion around the future of manufacturing. And we've got the big trends all the way around the world, I guess, with automation, digital transformation, Industry 4.0, taking hold to varying degrees from country to country, and they're big topics in the agenda. How would you assess the state of US companies and industry widely in their ability to adapt and capitalize on those trends.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a couple of levels to the question. There's this conversation happening about what is Industry 4.0 and what does it mean. Every conference I go to, there's a conversation about it, and some expression of bewilderment, but also some recognition that this is happening, it's being integrated. I think, interestingly, if you broaden the scope to the entire economy, I mean, manufacturing, among all of the sectors of the economy, has seen probably more automation already. And so the idea that there's going to be additional automation, I think, is not particularly surprising, and is something that I think most in the industry terms with. The digital transformation, artificial intelligence, the use of big data, I think that's a conversation that has been largely confined to the bigger firms who have more resources to devote to this. I think the core of manufacturing in the United States, provide the most jobs, is something that is underway. The U.S. has generally lagged behind some other countries in terms of our strategy and the integration that we have with public policy, the private sector, academia. We're playing some catch up, but we're not out of the game. And so I think that you're seeing some hopeful signs that this could be a benefit to firms moving forward. And, you know, robotics, automation, they're going to happen with or without, I think, the permission of the average citizen, the average worker, even the average plant owner. It's going to be essential to survive. So how you move towards that, how you augment the work of existing employees, figure out how it integrates into your business plan moving forward, I think is going to be vital for the success across the board here.
I think following on from that conversation piece, I think what do U.S. companies, whether they're big or small, need need more of, really, to become global leaders in the era of Industry 4.0? You know, whether do they need more skills? Do they need investment, infrastructure, more policy changes? What exactly is it that we're looking for here?
Yeah, I think the answer is maybe unsatisfying, but it's all of the above. So from a human capital perspective, there certainly has to be an understanding that manufacturing work will continue to transform. And just as even a steel mill today wasn't what it was 50 years ago, it will look, you know, a lot different 10 years down the road. How do you embed into the technical training, into the career training, which should be starting in high school? How do you embed that in the system so that you have a workforce that's prepared for this type of automation, for these types of robotics? I think second, we need this integration of research. So because there are remarkable developments taking place in basic research, and there's, you know, big data available now. How is that scaled? How is that commercialized? How is that integrated? How is that put into product development, into process improvements? I think that is underway. And I think in the United States, outside of specific corporate cultures, it's something that we're still struggling with. I think that we're making progress. And I think that we'll hear from a lot of folks at federal agencies and at other sorts of public-private partnerships that these efforts are underway. Reaching more manufacturers, I think, is going to be key to that. And then the last thing that I'd like to mention, and this is just from an American perspective, is that we tend to lag behind our competitors in terms of having a real kind of economic policy strategy to focus on these industries. It's not just enough to do the innovation. We need to have a plan so that it can be manufactured in the United States for our market, for export as well, or that we can be globally competitive. Again, I think that for the last 5 years, 6 years or so, there's been an understanding that that's necessary. I think that it's still in process, though, to get U.S. firms to be globally competitive in this new Industry 4.0.
You mentioned something interesting previously about how some of the bigger companies with resources were the ones that were trying to adapt to Industry 4.0 and making all those changes. What about the smaller manufacturers? How are they going to catch up with that? Are they going to be left behind in this new gig economy where the consumer is king?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think there are both challenges and opportunities. I think the opportunities are that as the customer demands much more faster
Yeah.
and customized, being close to the customer, being small, being nimble, that's going to have advantages. I think that will have advantages. Of course, that means that you have the process, you have the employee, you have the business strategy to meet those customer demands. And that's where I think that these kinds of public-private partnerships can help to fill the gap. And we do have a system in the United States. It's called the Manufacturing Extension Partnership system that helps to diffuse things like lean, workforce strategies, management succession planning, and it is focused on the new Industry 4.0 as well. I think that's going to be key. And I think the other aspect of this is that the big firms, the Fortune 500 firms, I think that to be successful, I think they understand that their value chains are going to have to be transformed as well. And so I hope that there is some feeding that way, not just a demand, but that it's a two-way relationship to help build that up. Look, this has always been the case. I mean, access for broadband for small and mid-sized firms came well after it did for large firms. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of the business and having capitalization and resources and management capacity to be able to integrate this. And so it's not a surprise, but it is an important challenge to get those small and mid-sized firms integrated into this new manufacturing environment.
And are there any particular disruptors that you can see doing a good job of adapting to these trends at the moment? Obviously, everyone talks about Amazon, but is there anyone coming up on the rails that you feel is, maybe adapting conventional models or is coming into the space with something fresh that other organizations should be taking note of?
It's a great question because a lot of people like to focus on the Silicon Valley disruptors or the software disruptors. I think that even though it may seem old-fashioned, that the builders of complex machines like aerospace, automotive, have been doing a great job at this for a long time. And they are now looking at the future and what the automotive market in an era of autonomous vehicles is going to look like, which is obviously dramatically different. They're looking at obviously different power sources. I mean, the next generation of vehicles is likely to be predominantly not based on the combustible engine, which is extraordinary. And so I don't think we always have to look at Silicon Valley to find this disruption. I think you can find it in places like Detroit or in Seattle, Washington, and Boeing, where these folks have been doing it well, and the stakes are much higher. I mean, if your computer screws up, you can just reboot it. Hard to do that in an automobile. I mean, I don't think that they get enough credit for the types of advances that they've made, but that's something that I always keep my eye on.
And in some ways, I guess they have a double challenge of not only being innovative, but changing an established culture. It's easier if you're starting out because you can build this stuff from scratch. You can build it into your DNA, as it were. So I suppose there's double credit due to those established industrial players for being able to pivot a very historic business and structure and culture. And in terms of the established players that haven't changed yet, is the writing on the wall for them? Do you think they can change, or are some of them just kind of facing now a long, steady decline unless they can make some fundamental changes?
That's a very good question, and I kind of look at it this way. Manufacturers, no matter which country they are operating in, are in fierce global competition. There's not too many firms that have a monopoly or an oligopoly in their sector. There is extraordinary competition. Manufacturing is also highly tradable. The barriers are very low, and so I think that has kept firms competitive. And in the United States, if you're a firm that has survived kind of the China shock, that has survived the Great Recession, you are probably already pretty lean, very productive, very competitive, and you want to build on those strengths. And there will always be churning. And so just as no one needs a VCR player anymore, and those firms are going to cycle out, I think looking for the new product developments. And I also think that looking to integrate the services into the manufactured product is going to be more important than ever for these firms to survive. It's fascinating to me that really, really bright entrepreneurial folks like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who both have started from a software perspective, PayPal and Amazon, have obviously more than dipped their toes into manufacturing. They're trying to build rocket ships that are going to go to Mars, and Elon Musk is trying to build massive fleets of electric vehicles, or scaling up PayPal. And there's a reason for that. There are large barriers to entry. You have to have a knowledge base. There's a lot of systems you have to get right. And I think the folks who have been in manufacturing have a deep understanding of that. And that will be helpful as we move through all of this transformation that we're seeing happen every day now.
When you spoke last with us, we talked about the encouraging signs that we're seeing in reshoring and the reshoring arena. A lot of American manufacturing companies bringing back production to the United States from cheaper emerging nations. Has that continued, do you think?
I do think it has, Maria, and it's a great question. And so I used to say that the job circulation was a one-way street. It used to be from the United States going out. I do think for about the past 7 or 8 years, it started to become much more of a two-way. And the United States is attracting foreign direct investment. And so you're seeing companies like LG, Samsung, still import some product into the United States, but also establishing a manufacturing foothold here. You're seeing that in other sectors as well. And I think with the energy boom that you've seen ongoing in the United States, that's certainly been attractive to bring energy-intensive industries back. And so I don't think that I can say that this trend has taken off and has taken over the entire ecosystem of manufacturing. But I do think that it is measurable, that it's having a palpable difference. And we've added in this nation 1.2 million manufacturing jobs since 2010. We've added a lot of output. We still have some trade challenges, obviously. But I do think that it's generally headed in the right direction. And I think one of the good things now is I think that firms are looking beyond just like, well, what's the labor cost? What's the labor cost of doing this? They're looking at the total cost of ownership. They're looking at all of these factors. And in this new manufacturing environment that we've talked about, it makes sense to both be close to your customer, to mitigate political risk, supply chain risk, particularly as weather and other things become way more unpredictable. I think that that's going to help the trend because, after all, the U.S. is by far still the largest customer market in the world, consumer market in the world. 5% of the world's population, but American consumers buy a lot of stuff, and so I think that trend could continue with the right policy support as we head into the future.
Yeah, you mentioned the policy behind that. For an organization that has offshored already and now wants to reverse that trend, I suppose it's a big chunk of their operations to kind of go back on that decision and bring manufacturing back to the US. For anyone that's listening that's thinking about that, I mean, how do they start that kind of process? It's easier said than done, I guess.
It is easier said than done, and you're right. And I always say, why can't we make an iPhone in the United States of America? Apple has wads of cash. It could figure this out if it wanted
true.
to. I mean, it makes beautiful phones. I'm sure it could figure this out. But I don't want to be flippant about it because, I mean, there are considerable challenges. I mean, a lot of that ecosystem gravitated to Asia. And you just can't add water and expect it to grow up overnight. You need the know-how, like someone, machine toolers or people in consumer electronics. I mean, a lot of that talent is either retired or gone elsewhere because it wasn't made in the United States. That takes some time to find the talent. It takes some time to find and kind of rebuild that cluster that you tend to see around different types of product development and commercialization. Obviously, you have clusters in the automotive sector and other sectors. It's hard to kind of scale up the reshoring effort, and it takes a lot of work. And I've seen cases where it hasn't worked, particularly in some consumer electronics, precisely because there is not that much of the value chain that's located in the U.S. But it's going to take it's going to take a new way of thinking. You have to find the talent. I think it's going to be a gradual process. But I do think there's some limits to it. And look, I mean, they're not built to be this way. They're built to return for investors or to provide value to customers. They're going to find the best way to do that. And so it has to be a good value proposition. And I think that, interestingly, as automation becomes much more prevalent, you'll see more of an impetus to look at the United States. But it's not going to be a tidal wave of reshoring. I think you're going to see it much more gradually filling out.
And in terms of your contacts at the moment, your industry contacts, what's the mood in general? Is the typical manufacturing company optimistic about the future? A little bit skeptical? What are people feeling right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been around to talk to a lot of folks in different types of industries. And obviously, as I said before, if you're in the metal sector, you're feeling pretty optimistic because of the trade, the trade position. I've been to other types of manufacturers who are optimistic because of the tax cuts and the type of business investments that they're able to make, that they've moved up by maybe 3 or 4 years, that are going to make them more effective, more efficient, and they're pretty optimistic. I think in general, there's a sense that they'd like to be on the other side of this trade conversation. I think a lot of folks realize that we do have trade challenges with China. I'm one of them. But I think providing some certainty about what it's going to look like in the future will be helpful, because we're kind of in an in-between period where we don't know if there's going to be tariffs or not tariffs, the extent of them. And I will say, when I've talked to business leaders, they can adapt to almost any scenario. They just want to know what it's going to be. They want to know what's going to.
Yeah, the uncertainty.
And obviously, they don't want. That's right. They don't want something to escalate. Nor do I. But they, I think that a lot of them have grievances with the way they've been treated in China. And so on the one hand, they're okay with pressing China on this. On the other hand, I think they'd like to see this settled to be on the other side of it for their business planning.
Sure. And Scott, AAM, a big part of what you do is obviously championing success stories in US manufacturing, whether that be companies or sectors or trends. What's happening now that is kind of particularly performing well and is cause for optimism that other companies could seize on?
Yeah, so sure. So I mentioned some of the big aerospace automotive sectors that seem to be humming along quite well. So let me focus on something that sometimes doesn't get a lot of focus. And I'm really encouraged by the trend of small scale urban manufacturing. Because the urban areas in the United States were the first to lose their kind of core manufacturing bases. They had the big factories; those left, caused a lot of distress in those communities. You're seeing a lot of urbanization in the United States. You're seeing a lot of demand for obviously locally produced stuff, starting with food and restaurants. It's moved to craft beer, but it's moving beyond that. And you're finding some interesting types of manufacturing taking place in New York City, in Los Angeles, in a lot of unlikely places. And I think that that's only going to grow. I think the demand for that is there. And I think it's a really interesting trend. And I will say that it kind of gives me hope as a manufacturing advocate that some of the best talent aren't off to get an MBA and just work on Wall Street.
Yeah.
They're looking at how to solve problems and create these environments for making things in the future. That's exciting to me.
Yeah. Well, that's a really nice positive note, I think, to wrap things up on. It sounds like large and small scale, there are opportunities and challenges nevertheless, but there's certainly a bright future in various forms for US manufacturing. So it was great to talk to you, Scott. We appreciate your time. And
we'll
be seeing you in Atlanta because you'll be at our event.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't wait. I'm looking forward to that, Marie and Tim, and to spending some time with some of these manufacturing leaders. It should be really exciting.